I do think organizations can be part of, and formal organizing structures can be part of coming into right relation with the process of life itself again, and helping us navigate this precarious trajectory that we're going to be on. And, maybe in multiple generations when you and I are stardust once again, or whatever it is that we become, the way that we organize, our formal organizing principles, our structures, our patterns, our processes, our rhythms, our rituals, will be life supporting, life enhancing, rather than life eroding, which I think is preponderant today.
My guest this week is Nate Kinch. Nate is a socio-technological ethicist. Thankfully, he explains in detail in the episode what that is. But essentially, he works at this intersection between values and technology and imagines how businesses can incorporate a new value system with which to integrate better decision-making, better processes, better systems to help engineer a better future for all. Nate and I enjoy a really wide-ranging conversation. We talk about the impetus of knowledge building, the modern story of separation, observation versus participation, and these drivers which are creating the poly-crisis that we're navigating today. We talk about whether or not we need an ethical cult building tradition, which is something we discuss in great detail. Finally, Nate walks us through what he's achieving with his work, giving a really nuanced analysis of what is trust, what are morals, ethics, values, these words perhaps that we throw around, especially in the corporate world, but perhaps don't hold very much meaning when the number one driver for business is shareholder value. Once giving a working definition of these words, he talks about how to build up trust, values, and ethics in corporations, and how these processes must be multi-directional, top down, bottom up, middle out. We then discuss the tension between words and action, and how complicated it is for the corporate world to essentially establish that it needs to decay, or it needs to have these mechanisms of decay built into it. Because the future that we need, as Nate says, is one of immaterial abundance and material simplicity. Nate, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. I'm a big fan, and I'm deeply grateful to be here.
Well, I'm deeply grateful you reached out, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, why is the world in crisis?
I can't believe you asked that question. Never done it before, right? So let me start by suggesting something like, we are presently amidst a total global ecosystem of interconnected crises with consistent underlying drivers. And, you'll be familiar with that framing. That's what many folks call the meta crisis. And, there are folks that kind of like debate a few things here and there, but there seems to be some reasonable convergence right now on something like that. Recognizing this, and if we can just take that for what it is for now, I have given some thought to how I'd like to approach this question, and I'm hoping that the angle I take, as I mentioned just before, it kind of plants a seedling, or the seed becomes a seedling, and all this type of stuff, and then whatever emerges from there, I'm sure will be what it needs to be. So I would probably say something like, we're in wrong relation as opposed to right relation with the process of life itself. And although what I'm going to suggest over maybe a couple of minutes has a nuanced historical context, there are flavorings of what I'm going to suggest in the Old Testament, in various different historical scripts, and we see it playing out across different sort of like spatio-temporal, socio-cultural contexts. I think what captures this quite nicely is something that some folks refer to as the modern story of separation. And it's, I would say, the narrative formally rose to prominence. Like, it was technically, legally, economically, and politically instantiated during around the 1600s, which, coincided with the early stages of what we refer to as the Western Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the first Dutch and English trading companies, all that jazz. And it goes something like this. Cringe alert. Nature is machine. Humans are separate from nature. Humans are separate from each other. Human progress arises from the conquest of nature. The earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. The purpose of life itself is to be wealthy and powerful. And to really hammer this home, Francis Bacon, who was a Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain at one point, he said, and just the framing here is obviously historically sort of accurate. So man people, we would hopefully frame it differently now. Man must render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature and establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe. Now that's a little bit grandiose, but if we decrease the scale and we come sort of within the biosphere, I think he got it about right. And, to some extent through this process, and again, there's no one point, it's not like there's a simple causality here. It's like we stopped being, we became more observers than participants. We separated mind from body and mind from matter, for that matter. And what has arisen out of this, which is probably closer to my direct professional interests, is a very narrow value system that I would say, and some folks might say this is extreme. I think many listeners of this podcast would, I think they would feel into this. Like, this narrow value system actively encourages life eroding processes. That might be a little bit more metaphysical than some answers, but it feels to me like something like, again, recognizing really complex causality, something like the causal core of this interconnected global ecosystem of crises with underlying drivers that we often call the meta crisis. Hopefully that seed has been reasonably well planted.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we can go back a step further to Plato and his perfect forms and this idea. I think it was the first time that the idea was floated that the material realm is the profane place. And there's this other place for humans, this like eternal, clean, sacred realm. And that's where we are destined to inhabit for all time. And thus you can see the kind of like Judeo-Christianism run out of that. There's one thing there's a part of this I want to pick up on and then keep digging. You said we became observers rather than participants. That is a very interesting frame if you take into consideration just how active we are being, like destructive in the biosphere. So what do you mean when you say we became observers rather than participants?
So this could get reasonably philosophically nuanced because we have many different conceptions of what it means to be an observer, and I don't think that's helpful. It's not the core of my expertise anyway, so I would want to be fairly like epistemically humble in approaching something like that anyways. But what I mean is, and I might attempt to end up framing this using something like a modern theory of what cognition is, but we can do it a different way first. So I'm tuning into this I'm in Nam, I'm in Melbourne. I live along sort of like the banks of the Birrarung, which is a really sacred place. We have had peoples in this part of the world for at least 70,000 years. It could be longer. That there's lots of difficulties with truly determining that. And our First Nations people, and there will be flavorings of this all around the world. I have almost no doubt. Had something like an animistic metaphysics, like there was an aliveness to the universe. And when First Nations people in this country refer to country, like with a big C, they're referring to everything: the sky, the land, the water, the animals themselves. We are an expression of country. And because we are sort of like this manifestation of the process that is life, we are not necessarily separate from, even though there's nuance here. There's a recognition that there is something that it's like to be me, and I show up in this world and I have something, I don't know, we might call it causal powers or whatever. Like if I throw the spear and this thing happens. But I think there was this, and again, I don't think this is unprecedented. I think depending on where you look sort of spatio-temporally, like this was relatively aligned to how different Homo sapiens would have kind of thought about life potentially, and their role within it. Like, so we were just part of this thing. And at some point, and again, it's really hard to know when something like this may have really happened, and it's probably more like a happening. Like if you think about, I don't know, the way that Wengrow and Graeber in their Dawn of Everything describe and I think they've done a very good job of that. Maybe the nuance and the color or diversity of different like socio-cultural organizing principles at different times, places, etc. So I think there's something like that. We were part of it. We saw ourselves as part of it, and at some point we started potentially becoming more intellectual in our ways of knowing, like what and this is just on a recording a few days ago with Dr. John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto and does. I was definitely fanboying. I'm a huge fan of the quality of his work, but he's contributed some really important things I think in the cognitive sciences. And one of the things that he talks very eloquently about is the 4 Ps. And this describes different ways of knowing. So we have propositional knowing, we have procedural knowing, we have perspectival knowing, and we have participatory knowing or knowledge. And using that sort of frame, I think what's happened to some extent is we've lost touch of the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory knowing or knowledge. And we've kind of like overemphasized the propositional, like the stuff that relates to facts or beliefs or claims. And when we do that, we're sort of stepping back from something and we're saying, hey, this is what is. And we kind of become disconnected from whatever it is that we're observing. And rather than attempting to understand how are we situated within this thing, the process of life, an ecology, a community, whatever it is, we're trying to explain the thing to itself, how it works, etc. So I was sort of going in that direction with that. What may have felt like a little bit of a throwaway comment, but I'm glad that you picked up on it, and I'm hoping that additional context is somewhat useful.
Definitely. So there's an element of like our quest for knowledge being somewhat tautological, like explaining to the thing itself how it itself functions. Why is it the focus of our work when things don't need to be explained, things just are. And it seems to me perhaps that explaining the mechanics of a thing. Hang on, wait, do I think this? Explaining the mechanics of a thing is much easier than explaining the spirit of a thing, because there are things that we can know about the mechanics because of certain laws of physics. Whereas that very deep and uncomfortable question that arises from deep within the well of each human, which is, who am I? Why am I here? What is this? Is it real? Is everyone else real? These questions are much more difficult to answer. And I think that there's this very interesting relationship when we begin to think about science and the Enlightenment as part of an emergent process of like knowledge gardening throughout the years, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. And the fact that there was all of this focus on spirit, but as if spirit had been established, as if that was done, as if the books had been written. And then I think it's almost unsurprising that the scientific culture that came out of that was almost, an equal and opposite reaction to look at the mechanics, but was actually still done in a relatively similar way, as if, well, if we just keep going, eventually we will find the end point. We will find the formula, or we will find the thing that completes our knowledge of this thing. We'll be able to put it down and move on to the next chapter. It has a linearity around it rather than an emergence or a dynamism, I think. And I've never thought about this before, but now thinking about it, I think it really actually speaks to the religious texts.
Yeah, look, it's I think it's a really pertinent point, and there are many scholars, commentators, public intellectuals that I've heard make something like the claim that we need the equivalent of, and I want to approach this with care and humility, because this could be interpreted in many different ways, but something like a new religion, a new doctrine, and you have many different folks who've talked about this, and there was an interesting one. Jamie Wheel discussed the idea in his Recapture the Rapture, rethinking God, sex, and love in a world that's gone mad, or I think that's something like the subtitle. It's a really interesting exploration, but I think he sort of describes it as something like ethical cult building, and others have described, well, what would it mean to connect with something the way that perhaps we've connected with a religion in the past, but do so with potentially some of the benefits of modern scientific understanding, some of the benefits of a more diverse and holistic value system that doesn't treat this person like this and that person like that. And I think there's something to that. I don't know quite how far to take that, because there are many different issues associated with everything from, well, what is kind of like the teleology, the goal orientation of it? What are the organizing principles? How do folks come together? How are they situated? Where is it situated? How does it interface with and connect with everything else that we see? Is it even necessary? There are times when I'm walking in the bush, and we have a very distinctive landscape here in Australia, particularly different parts of it, because I'm right down sort of the bottom of the mainland. So our bush is fairly distinctive, and I'm walking in the bush and I might just start crying because like it's just an awe-inspiring moment. And I feel like, wish I could just bottle that up, because that's what we need. You know what I mean? It's like, I am this is me, like we are, and holy fuck, it's beautiful. I hope I can say that. Yeah. So I don't know. There's really challenging issues, and I'm not a again, there my work is hugely transdisciplinary, and I call on so many different disciplines, and I'm interested in so many different things. But I also recognize that in attempting to be quite broad and integrated, there are certain topics that some people can speak to just much more wholesomely than I can. So I would be remiss, I think, if I went too far in that direction, having not probably thought through it as well as I would like, and to then expose, to the world, hey, here's my thesis for how we have a new religion. I'm the cult leader, everyone. Are you ready? That's why I'm growing the beard. Yeah. Oh,
That's
gosh.
where this is going.
Yeah, I knew it. I just needed a platform. Come on.
Don't worry about it. This is a space. This is a safe space for jacks of all trades.
Amazing. Thank you.
So let's see what we can come up with. I'm gonna hit right back and be like, absolutely not. I do see that it is often men who are proposing this, that we need a new religion, we need a new value system, and all this kind of stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, I agree we need new value systems. I think that using the tool of domination and oppression in order to create that for the new world is an absolute disaster. These things are like fundamentally hierarchical, fundamentally oppressive. And I think anything that switches off our critical thinking capacity, which is what religion is built to do, it would be incredibly dangerous. And to me, I think perhaps it reveals how we tend to lump indigenous cultures in together nowadays, where it's a very, very, very diverse group of cultures. Very, 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 very diverse. You've got some people in the heartlands of Papua New Guinea, no matter what the government tells you, who are still cannibals. And then you've got other people who are, matriarchal, and she's also still in Papua New Guinea, like matriarchal and nonviolent and all this kind of stuff. Like, the whole point of a beautiful world is as a diverse one. Like, I love that feeling that you have walking through the bush, this incredibly like distinct, beautiful bush, and it's awe, and you want to bottle up and not sell it to people, give it to people.
Whoa, you've just given me a business idea. Thank you very much.
But the point is that is awe-inspiring as well, because that's that part of Australia. Like, we don't want the entire world's bush to look like that. We don't want all of the landscape and geography and all of this to look like that.
Yes.
And so, like, culturally, I think we have to risk our flaws. This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I've been thinking about it with regards to like this old binary of like the left and right, and like these things that they are fundamentally terrified of and like building to protect against. And I think this is part of the issue kind of with Western thinking. There's so much fear. There's so much fear in everything we do. And there is this kind of like protection instinct I hear a lot of, wanting to protect against the worst of what is inevitably going to come with regards to the meta crisis, the worst with regards to our own nature, the worst with regards to the fallout of the systems that we've created, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're just going to have to saddle up and accept that there is bad stuff as well.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we are going to create systems in which, because some bloke wrote down in a book that you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, you still can't work on the Sabbath a couple of thousand years later. Get a grip. No,
I
thank you.
no look. I hope, and I don't think you took that exploration to suggest that I was saying we need what you're saying we don't need. I don't think that's where we were going, but my read on this, and I think you're probably right. When I think about who have I heard proposing these ideas, it probably mostly is men. With that said, and I want to be, again, I want to be really caring and humble about how I approach this. I haven't taken from what they're suggesting, we need a religion the way that we've thought about religion before. What I think they're suggesting is something more like we need to connect with something on a deeper level, the way that perhaps we may have connected with religion in the past. I think there's something more substantive to that. And I don't think that necessarily means a doctrinal, i.e. dogmatic approach to any one sort of narrow value system that is exerted through something like a system of oppression, because I literally don't want to live in a world like that, right? We're talking about my daughter before, I think like now, I suppose when you have a child, I think there's quite a different orientation that you have, because a huge amount of your reflexivity, etc., becomes about like, is what I'm doing contributing to more favorable conditions for her to flourish, for her to express her agency, for her to make mistakes, but within some sort of like relative boundaries of safety. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that really quickly, because I know that the world that we live in now, sometimes stuff gets really quickly taken out of context, and a position may be proposed merely as a curiosity or an exploration or something in the spirit of like dialogos, this like multi-directional exchange that we're part of right now, which is so beautiful and we need so much more of. And then someone takes a snippet. He said this. He actually wants to be a cult leader. No, I was joking. Please don't think that at all. But everything that you said, absolutely. And I think if we live in anything other than a world where it's again, there's nuance to this. So a difference, there is like inherent truth, goodness, and beauty in our difference. With that said, one of the things that I think we fail to recognize is our sameness. Like we are so the same. And these little quirks and idiosyncrasies, like they're fucking brilliant. Like that's like, if I was just in a room at a party with me 20 times over, that would be horrendous. You know what I mean? But like, we're also so similar. Like when we get to, and I don't know whether you go down to the level of something like spirit or essence or however you want to describe it, but even in terms of our hopes and fears and desires, and when you take away the constructs and the labels and the approximations, like, holy crap, we're so similar. And I think we realize that when we actually like break bread with someone, like we're just there with them to be there with them. Like we're just in that process together. And it's like, oh my God, like you grew up here, I grew up here, this different time and place. And we had all these different influences, and like our particulate matter has never interacted before until now, even though right now we're basically exchanging particulate matter. But like there is a oneness to it. Yeah. So I'm with you, and I'm so passionate about that. And I believe, like, I'm actively hopeful that we can come into deeper relation with that, because I think it's necessary to go through the, frankly, inevitable challenges that we might face for not just decades, it might be centuries.
I think that's such a beautiful point that we can keep teasing out. I had Sarah Stein-Librano on the show a while back, who was talking about the fact that this sense of self and I is like a fundamentally weird concept from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. And that in other cultures around the world is just not that important. The sense of the collective or of belonging, community is much more important and much more embedded in each person's experience. And I agree with you. There's something incredibly rich about our cultural diversity and incredibly soothingly similar about our essential being.
Mm.
And how wonderful that so much diversity can spring up from what is essentially the same experience over and over and over and over again with us, these creatures. You know, we do fundamentally have very similar values around the world, very similar drives, desires, hopes, dreams, fears, and all these kinds of things. And yet, I mean, the languages that we speak, the art that we create, the music that we sing, it's so diverse. But what is also the same is that we want to sing, we want to dance, we want to create music, and we want to speak to each other. And I guess this is why, with regards to like the ethical cult building and all this kind of stuff, I hear you. You don't want to be a cult leader. I didn't think that. Don't worry. But good to just, I don't want to be either. Just if we're going to put that note in the,
Good
but
point.
I don't want to be either one.
I was curious, you know, you never know, right?
I think I'd make a good one, I have to say. But I don't.
I agree. Just where do I sign up? Just, yeah.
This wonderful nugget of truth just isn't really spoken about enough, just how similar we are. And thus, I feel like it's a lack of trust. When people really, really panic about the future, when we panic about the fact that people who have too much concentrated power are going to make bad decisions because our brains just aren't built to deal with the complexity that we have created. And also our spirits and our egos aren't built to have that much power. And so typically people in those scenarios, situations do repeatedly make the wrong mistakes, make mistakes. And yet that is kind of then projected down the human line onto everyone. Whereas like, I've got quite a lot of faith that I've not got faith that everything's going to be okay, but I've got quite a lot of faith that in the aftermath, we will be okay. Because people, from what I see, people are good. People are cool. People want to sing and dance and make love and make art.
Just take me back to the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Look, I'm so with you. And you brought up something like most of my career, I've focused on the topic of trust. You know, so I'm a socio-technology ethicist, and
I think you're gonna have to explain to people what that means.
Yeah. So really, I'm bringing together different disciplines, socio-technical theory, applied ethics, etc. And I'm basically looking at the relation between human values, how they emerge, the way that they're expressed, how they're animated, and the way that that influences the technologies that we design, and how this becomes something like a niche construction. You know, we design the technology then designs us. And how can we do that fundamentally better? How can we do that in a way where there is something like genuine democracy, where when we're building something, there is like an actual representative sample of the people who will be directly and indirectly impacted, actively involved in the process of designing the thing, whether it ought to be a thing in the first place. And trying to balance the kind of like pragmatic constraints of how things work with the beauty that can come from kind of like some type of grounded theoretical rigor. And I've done that across like a million different contexts. But what it often comes down to, and a lot of the work ends up focusing on trust, reputation, and what we might think of as social license to operate. So let's say you take a corporation, right? There's a whole can. There could be a whole can of worms, but I'll try and keep it reasonably tight. So you take a corporation, and really they have one value to rule them all, kind of like Sauron. Their teleology, their goal orientation is maximize shareholder value. And it's really hard because actually you get some amazing people within these organizations who are quite aware and who care quite deeply, who are stuck within a paradigm, if you will, if you want to use that parlance, that doesn't really enable them to do the things that they want to do and express their values. And that there's a lot of moral dissonance in corporations. And I actually think there's a really strong productivity argument for how significant that moral dissonance. So, you know, we can that's a different story. But so these corporations, they want to do the thing that they want to do. And often what they say is like, oh, there's a trust problem. We've got to solve the trust problem. Now, there's a lot of equivocation in the trust literature and just in general conversations when we speak about trust. People say the same word but mean different things. There's no broadly agreed definition. There are hundreds. The definition I work with is the willingness to be relationally vulnerable based on positive expectations. That's just a working definition. It gives us something to roll with. It doesn't really tell us what trust is. Trust is something like a biopsychosocial phenomena. It's impacted by lots of different factors, including our life experience, our beliefs, the way that our genes express themselves in different situations, epigenetics. Like there's lots of different stuff. It's not just like, I am rational person A in context B, dealing with rational person C. And I will assess the trustworthiness of rational person C and make a logical and well-reasoned judgment about whether I want to relate to them for this purpose. Now, that's part of it because we do have some of those capacities, but those capacities aren't all we have. And we have other sort of enabling and disabling constraints. So push that to the side because that can get very sort of academic. The corporation, we want more trust because trust is good for business. It means we can do more of what we want to do. Really what I think they're saying is they want favorable social license to operate. They want people, as in the market, if you will, to generally accept what they're doing so that they can do more of it. And what they then do is they go outside of the building. They don't take a good hard look in the mirror and they go, what can we do out there to make people believe that that we're trustworthy, that we've got a good reputation so we can do the things we want to do? And I sort of encourage them to step back and I go, all right, well, I actually think that theory of change is invalid for all of these different reasons. And here's why. Here's the empirical evidence that I draw upon. And I think we have good reason to believe that this is a nice starting point. Let's come back. Let's look in the mirror, take a really good intentional look in the mirror. We might not like everything that we see and start with, what is our purpose? What are our values? What are our principles? What is the value system that we basically refer to when we're making decisions, when we're designing our organization, when we're trying to figure out whether we should do product X or product Y or none at all, when we should change our incentive structures, etc. When we do that, and that's basically ethics, ethics and morals, similar etymology, different parts of the world, sometimes they're used interchangeably, other times they're not. I think of morals as something like, and I'm not the only person to suggest this, although philosophers can rarely agree on anything. Morals is something like our first order beliefs about what is good and right, and ethics as the active process that we execute when we're sort of like deliberating on those first order beliefs and we're going, all right, in this situation, in this context, with these factors, these things that we know, these things that we don't know, with this as our backdrop, as in these first order principles, these moral beliefs, what is the good and right thing to do? Like, how should we act and why? So that's how I kind of draw the distinction. So I help organizations try and build up that ethical hypertrophy, build up those muscles, build up those capabilities within the organization. That then translates to what I would describe as organizational features of trustworthiness. So benevolence, integrity, and competence. And just really quickly to define terms, benevolence, I mean something like a teleology or goal orientation that's like people and planet positive. Like it's actually about doing good. And there are different ways that we could describe that, but I think that's a simple enough way. Integrity, we basically just mean how tight is the relationship between what we say and what we do? And then competence, how consistently do we deliver on our value promises? And it's more like a Venn diagram because these things interrelate and overlap. Because for instance, integrity and competence are sort of like interconnected, interdependent. Benevolence massively impacts integrity, these types of things. And when we do that, what we tend to see, and we can't control this because this is outside of the building, right? We can directly influence the organizational design work that we do. And then what we hope is that positively translates to like an uplift in the belief that people have in our trustworthiness, which, what they believe. Reputation is what people say about us, and reputation and trust as in the belief, tight correlation. There's sort of like maybe different expressions of something like the same or a similar thing. And then social license is basically like the combination of trust and reputation. So instead of focusing out there, it's kind of like, let's come back inside. It's like for an individual, it's like doing deep inner self work, transcending the paradigm of self and my patterning and my trauma and all this different types, but doing that for organizations. And the hope is over time, we can do, and you're probably familiar with Bill Sharp's 3 Horizons framework, that's used in professional futures practice.
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. So what it is, it's a visual tool that professional futures practitioners use. And what it sort of describes is, kind of describes something like a theory of change. So there are 3 horizons, these overlapping curves. The first one, H1, is business as usual. And what it does is it starts up high and then it drops down low. And the basic idea there, Rachel, is we recognize that often BAU doesn't serve us optimally, as in the royal us, like all life within the biosphere. And so we have to actively biodegrade the stuff that isn't serving some possibility of a better future. Then H3, which sort of goes the other way, it's kind of like the inverse, it starts low, ends up high, is a vision that we have for something like a civilizational architecture where everyone's fundamental needs are met within the constraints of the biosphere. I don't know, you could describe that in different ways. Rayworth's donut economics, there's so many different visions for how we might describe that. But how does humanity and the rest of life flourish without destroying the possibility of future life? Something like that. And then Horizon 2, H2, is kind of like, well, how do we change the conditions? How do we close the gap between these two states? And H, and then it gets additional nuance. Like H2 plus is stuff that we can do that is in service of this beautiful, pluralistic, expressive, flourishing future. And H2 minus is stuff that keeps reinforcing BAU, which we don't want. And so I sort of look at it like that. I think that we have to actively biodegrade many of our stories, many of our beliefs, and this goes really deep. This is like our metaphysics. This is like what we believe about the universe and the nature of humans and all this sort of stuff. Many of them are just empirically ridiculous now anyway. Like this idea, life is all about competition. No, it's more like a dynamic dance that features competition, co-opetition, cooperation, and collaboration, right? It's those 4 C's. And actually, that's what gives life this beautiful, diverse, like, expression. So I look at it like this. We've got to biodegrade the stuff that's harmful. We've got to have these like really ambitious directional goals about how we can live more wholesomely together in the future. Something like immaterial abundance with material simplicity. And then we have to be kind of like strategic and experimental and reflective and humble and approach all of this with this like, open, curious learning mindset when we're doing the H2 plus stuff. We have a like a sort of benevolent orientation, but not everything works out. Sometimes there are unintended consequences. So how do we learn what works, do more of that, like really just permanently get rid of the shit that doesn't, the stuff that harms people or an ecology or whatever. So when you bring up the trust thing, it's like that makes me come alive because that's basically all I do is, so I know, hopefully that's useful, because I think a lot of the time people think, oh, business is going to, like, if you're in the green growth type category, like business and innovation is going to be the answer. And I think there's a partial truthfulness to that. Like, innovation has to be part of this. I don't think business per se is part of it, but at least not the way that we traditionally think of it. But innovation, yes, absolutely. Like our ingenuity coming together and participatorily innovating, like, yes. But at the same time, we don't want to go like, and then people misinterpret things like degrowth or steady state or whatever it is. Oh, we're going to live in caves. Not quite. There are many different principles. There's lots of nuance. But I do think organizations can be part of, and formal organizing structures can be part of coming into right relation with the process of life itself again, and helping us navigate this precarious trajectory that we're going to be on. And, maybe in multiple generations when you and I are stardust once again, or whatever it is that we become, the way that we organize, our formal organizing principles, our structures, our patterns, our processes, our rhythms, our rituals, will be life supporting, life enhancing rather than life eroding, which I think is preponderant today.
I think for things and systems and corporations and all that to be life supporting, they need to have built in like decay mechanisms, essentially, much like the biological world. Things need to have their death coded in, and things need to learn how to die. And I suppose I'm interested what all of what you said means in practice. Like, how is it that by redesigning trust and creating a system of ethics or reimagining the value in corporations, how is it that they then begin to actively and materially begin supporting life?
So I could give you an idealized state of how it could work, but I'm not sure how helpful that is. And I think it's possible, but I don't want to describe something that is mismatched with really where things are at. So let's be very practical. So at the moment, an organization has one value that rules them all. Now they might have fluffy value statements and all of these different types of things, but the empirical literature suggests that there probably isn't even a statistical correlation between these published stated values and the way that that's expressed in culture and organizational behavior. So they're like, are they worth doing? Yes, but they're not really acted on or operationalized or whatever. They're not part of how organizations operate. So the first thing that we need to do is something like, okay, so we've got this one value and it's like a pyramid. It's kind of like make money as much as possible, right? Or approximations for money as much as possible. And then below that, if we can do other stuff that's kind of good, happy days. Now, if you're in a board meeting, that's not actually how the conversations go. Again, you have a number of people who are caring and thoughtful and who can take their work hat off and go home and embrace their child and feel hopeful about the future and feel terrified about all of this stuff. So I don't want to paint people as monsters because I don't think it's often the case. Every now and then it is, but I don't think it's that often the case. So we need to come into the organization and we need to operate at the level of the board. The board needs to communicate with shareholders. The CEO needs to be completely on board and it needs to become a thing. Now, that sounds like quite a top-down thing, but the beauty is there is so much momentum from the bottom already. So what we need in any organizational change initiative is a strong relation between top-down, bottom-up, middle, in, and out. If it's just bottom-up, doesn't work. If it's just top-down, doesn't work. You're right. So we need something like a holism. But I think one of the best and most practical ways to start to really have an impact is with the board of directors. For the most part, what we tend to see, organizations don't actually work like a hierarchy. They're more like a mycorrhizal network. But I'm using this language just to interface with the way that, like, I don't know, a shitty organizational chart looks, right? So the people at the bottom of the organization, and again, I'm not assigning a value judgment there, but I just want to be clear about that. So the people at the bottom of the organizational hierarchy, most of them want this stuff anyways. It's just impractical for them to act on it, but for like a million different reasons. So we start there. So we say, hey, money's not the only thing that we care about. We might care about our contribution to 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries, or like whatever it is. And we can have whatever value system that we like. You can frame it probably not through something like an ESG for heaps of different reasons. That's a flop. And but you could look through the lens of social foundations or ecological sealing, or I don't know, take the work that Sophie Howe and the crew in Wales did. Like one of the things that they did was bring back the Welsh language, right? Like which was part of the work that they were doing and that she was doing as the commissioner for future generations. So it might be something that doesn't seem super obvious, because often we think about like biophysics, like material flows and stuff like this. Like that's really obvious. Well, nitrogen, phosphorus, ocean acidification, atmospheric carbon, methane, like these are really obvious things, but there are other things that might form part of this value system. And we might then describe this like, so instead of the pyramid, we might describe it as like a spider plot. So there's like a hexagon or whatever it is. And we have these, let's say there's 5 or 6 or 7 or however many values, probably not too many, because we have to be able to actually relate to them, understand them, act on them, observe how we're progressing in relation to them, use that to inform various different actions, optimizations, etc. But instead of like, hey, success looks like this, lots of money flowing to the top, because that's how it happens, right? Trickle down's BS. We have something like a circle that represents all of these values. And we start integrating that into what we might think of as corporate governance. And a lot of people will have certain views of corporate governance. There's, again, it's a little bit like trust in some ways. There's no broadly agreed definition, but we tend to agree that there are 2 core functions. It's about setting organizational or corporate strategy and identifying and attempting to mitigate corporate risks. And that's the core responsibility of the board, if you want to think about it that way. So we then integrate that value system into the way that the organization sets strategy. So it's theory, how it describes an integrated set of choices for how it will operate, and the way that it identifies and mitigates certain uncertainties or what we often call risks. And that can play out in lots of different ways. It could become something like a truer value/cost accounting method. It could become something that goes up to the board every quarter, that is then reported on publicly, and it becomes part of how the market assesses the efficacy of the organization, if you want to think about it that way. But very importantly, it then has to flow down into how the organization actually operates, the people doing, what sometimes you'd colloquially refer to as the real work, building a machine learning model, doing customer service, whatever it is, right? And this starts coming down into the goal orientation of a new product development process, the incentive structures and disincentive structures for middle management, if they happen to be necessary. Look, I could sort of go on and on, all the way down to customer communications, information disclosures, the way that we do contracts. For instance, the way that we do contracts, absolutely horrific. They exist to protect an organization and disenfranchise the individual engaging with the organization. So it can even affect the way that we design contractual terms. We make the contract more visual. We see comic book contracts and all different types of things being spun up around. So it really is like I hate these how long is a piece of string thing, but like we can approach organizational design with this type of orientation in lots of different ways. And we don't even necessarily have to start there. This is really important. A lot of my board will never agree to this. Let's say it's a CEO that's really motivated, but they don't quite have the support of the board. My board will never agree to this. All right. What if we conducted something like a risk mitigated experiment that expresses a more holistic value system, demonstrate how that has a better impact on the world, and then feed that evidence back up into the board to make a really strong quote unquote business case for why we should do this. Now, is that going to carry us all the way to where we need to be? No, I don't think so. I think so much of what we have in society needs to be biodegraded. But I think what it can do is something like incrementally contribute, because there's heaps of people already working on new systems, right? And it's not Unilever that's working on a new system, or Coca-Cola, or I don't know, whatever big HSBC or whatever big corporation we want to think of. It's like community stuff. It's radical. It's going back to the roots of things. But there are people, millions of incredible people all around the world, self-organizing and building new systems. And what we want to see is those sort of rise like this. And what happens hopefully with the corporations, I shoot myself in my own foot by saying this, right? But I kind of have to. What happens with the corporations in many cases is they either transform, biodegrade the old, and contribute to these new systems, or over time they actually do just biodegrade and something else emerges in their place. And that might take, for some corporations, 10 years. For others, it might take, and many of them are just going to collapse, right? But 10 years, for others, it might take 50, because again, huge amount of skills, resources, capabilities, knowledge, know-how, the works within these organizations. We have to find a way to use these materials, use these resources wisely for something like a more normative purpose. So like, that's the kind of work that I end up doing, and it gets applied in, I don't know, biotech or synthetic biology, machine learning, deep learning, AI, healthcare, financial services, like lots of different application contexts. But that's the kind of gist of the process, spirit, essence, orientation that I try and go through, often with a lot of difficulty.
I'm glad to hear you shoot yourself in the foot with that final bit. That sometimes this leads to these organizations biodegrading or transforming, because I guess something that I am particularly attuned to listening out for, essentially, is this like very dematerialized approach we have to solving the problem as like a dematerialized people, a people whose sort of founding intellectual discourse is I think, therefore I am, a people whose economy is totally divorced from the biosphere, a people who actually believe in, decoupling as a solution to our problems. Like, I'm very, very conscious that kind of like demateriality can infect a lot of how we approach even our solutions. And so when we talk about values and when we talk about these like narrative shifts and when we talk about all of that, we also then don't talk about like the material impacts of that, like material reductions. To me, it sounds like greenwashing. So I know you said you just shot yourself in the foot, but if you hadn't, you would have had me hounding you at the end of all of that.
And if you didn't, I would have been like, you disappointed me because this is what I expect from you. And look, it's really, I got to admit, it's really hard. And I've had a lot of financial stress over my life, and a lot of people kind of like us probably have had this, like, because you really believe that we need something fundamentally different, and you express that, and then the market doesn't want to pay you for that. So it's an interesting paradox, which is kind of like a beautiful microcosm of this life thing that I think I'm living right now. But I think it's really important. There are types of tensions that I am happier to have than others. Now, don't get me wrong. I have a child. Like, I have to put food on the table. I want her to have shelter. Like, you know, there are important material needs that and responsibilities, in fact, that I have as a parent, that are really important to me. And so there are times where, and I know in the past, and I think I've done a really good job of avoiding this as much as I can. I really have. But I can see points in the future where I will have to make trade-offs, because it's hard to see, like, how am I going to keep a roof over our heads if, hi, you need to biodegrade. Pay me for that, please. So, and of course it's not that simple. But yet, you know, there are, and look, I'm speaking from such a position of relative privilege. Like I have such a beautiful life that I'm so grateful for in so many different ways. And there's barely a minute that goes by that I don't tap into that gratitude in some way, shape or form. Do you know what I mean? So I want to be really clear about that. But suffering, like, you know, suffering is still suffering. We shouldn't get into suffering competitions. Many of us have different challenges, and I don't know your story. I don't know what the last 31 years of your life has been like. You sit here, you talk eloquently, you're doing what I believe is really important work, but like, how many difficult things have you had to deal with? How many challenges have you faced? How many times have you felt like giving up? We're all having this human experience, and sometimes it's just fucking hard. Even if it looks kind of good from the outside, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not on Instagram or anything like that, but like, you can look like you have an Instagram lifestyle, and some people do, but I know them in a deeper way, and it's like, they're really struggling. Like, their life is really hard. And if we don't sit with them and break bread and get to see how similar we are, in fact, to them, sometimes we approximate or caricaturize them in such, oh, fuck them, you know, they're living this, like, and I don't think that's helpful either. Now, don't get me wrong, for some people that probably is true. That's probably a justifiable criticism. And I may have been guilty of casting it a few times in my life, but just to put that out there, like, I'm not, this is not a sob story. You know what I mean? Like, it's a beautiful privilege to be able to even try this, like, to attempt this, is actually, it's a real privilege. And I try my best not to take that for granted.
I think it's amazing that there are people who, and this is why we should be hopeful, right? Or like optimistic at least, that there are people who want to engage with this, who understand the necessity of building in the decay mechanism to the thing that they love most, because so much of all of our work is passion projects, right? Like, somebody asked me about a year ago, we were talking about death. And I was like, just like super enlightened after recently doing loads of ayahuasca, you know? I was like, yeah, I just don't really care. Like, kill me, whatever, you know?
Yeah.
I went back to the void. I was so high, I went back to the void. And, you know, and it really done, like, it's true. Like, the idea of my own death now is very whatever. And then they said, okay, well, imagine you wake up tomorrow and planet critical's just gone. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I don't, what? And like the existential panic I felt, because this is my baby. This is my passion project. This is what gives me purpose. Really, this is what gives me purpose to get up in the morning. And so I think when we start recognizing, you know, as well, that for so many people who are making decisions in boardrooms that seem inconceivable, it's their passion. It's what gets them up in the morning. And we want to take away their purpose, essentially. That's how it's perceived. And so we have to find ways of working through these emotional truths in
Mm,
order to eventually get to that like rational prefrontal cortex. Like this whole thing of, the positions of our brain and the fact like that the rationality, the prefrontal cortex is first, then you've got like, the limbic system way at the back. And it's kind of the wrong way around, essentially. That might be correct physiologically, but you got to start from the back and work your
mm.
way forward. You don't get to speak to the rational bit unless you've soothed the emotional bit first. And
Yeah,
I think more empathy in that respect is very helpful.
totally. And I mentioned earlier, I really, and I know we're almost out of time, but this might be close to a nice ending because all things must end. And I also like, this quote from the Buddha 2,500 odd years ago: "Everything changes, comma, always." There's a lot of value, I think, in meditating on in permanence, in impermanence, just to make that clear. But I mentioned some of that cognitive sciences work, and there's I suppose a description of cognition called the 4E cog-sci approach. And there have been two E's added to that. And basically what it proposes is that cognition doesn't occur exclusively in the head. Often we think, oh, rational is brain, emotion is like sort of something, or that they're these distinct separate things. So it doesn't occur exclusively in the head, but is variously embodied, embedded, enacted, and slash or extended by way of extracranial processes and structures. And John that I mentioned before, Dr. John Bavacki, he added emotional and exapted, as in like exapted from evolutionary biology. And when we look at something like cognition, and human cognition does seem to be unique, at least as far as we can tell, we're selling ourselves so short if we think of cognition as being something like mind is only responsible for logic, reason. And I come into this when a number of professional philosophers throughout my career have said something along the lines of, there's no role for emotion in ethics. And I go, oh, interesting. So what is ethics?
Idiots.
And they, well,
Sorry.
I try to be reasonably nuanced in my dialogic practice, and but
There's
no,
me going on about empathy and be like,
fuck
twats.
that. I'm gonna use that one from now on. But no, so what I actually do, because you got to kind of play their game, because one thing that philosophers tend to be very good at, if you provide a good argument or rationale, they'll often come round. And so what I say is, I respond with is something like, oh, that's interesting. So what? So the claim they will make is, well, ethics isn't emotional; it's a rational process. Okay, so what's
Oh, come
rationality? And they go,
on.
well, it's our ability for reason and logic. And I say then, well, what gives, so that I have a conditional logic here, right? So what gives rise to our ability for reason and logic? Oh, our cognition. And then I say, oh, well, what is cognition? And oh, this. And I go, well, actually, one of the, probably like one of the, if not the leading theories is this. And I describe the 4E, 6E model. And it doesn't seem that we can separate emotion. Like emotion is part of cognition. Like, our technology and our environment is part of cognition. You and I together in conversation are engaged in a cognitive processing, and we are producing more robust knowledge, if you will, and different ways of knowing by doing that together. And I think there's something, and look, I'm not saying everyone I speak to first time is like, oh, great, I'm sold. But it definitely opens a door that I think they had padlocked prior to that. And what I think that does is it also makes, 'cause a lot of philosophers get very quite paternalistic about like the process of philosophy. And I look at philosophy, like little p philosophy, as the loving process of wisdom seeking, something that even when we're not trying, we all actually exist in relation to. It's almost like an inherently human endeavor. Um, and ethics is no different. Like this capacity that we seem to have to describe something as salient or relevant or good or valuable or truthful or beautiful or however we want to describe it, and then orient our actions towards that. Like, holy shit, that's something that we can all do. And the best ethical decisions that I've ever seen made are made when the people directly and indirectly impacted by those ethical decisions are part of the process itself. And you could sort of like refer to, democratizing ethics, and sometimes those things get taken all over the place, but there is something like that. I think there's so much richer moral imagination, discourse, deliberation, decision-making, and sort of like refinement or optimization when we do the process of ethics together. And I think if we do that better together, there's reason to be actively hopeful that through the madness, through the worst of whatever the meta crisis produces, maybe we come into right relation with life itself. And some of the little tidbits that we've been describing throughout this, maybe that becomes, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 future generations. Like that's their reality. And that's worth working towards. It's worth living for. It's potentially worth dying for. It's beautiful.
I think a lot of what our task is breaking down the drawbridges, destroying the drawbridges and filling in the moats of intellectual discourse, essentially. Like, so much of what we've been talking about today is really, it's about people sitting down and speaking to one another, and people going out and like widening their understanding of community, and people having faith in one another. Like even this kind of tradition of ethics, and it being a kind of like logical intellectual debate that one participates in. It's fundamentally infantilizing in a sense, because it suggests that only certain part of the population have the intellectual prowess in order to engage with this, and they're the ones that should be making decisions than everybody for the little man, essentially.
Absolutely,
because
totally.
the little man is just fundamentally emotional, and
you wouldn't
everybody is
get it.
capable.
Sit down, it's
Exactly.
like, just watch Netflix tonight.
Exactly.
Just binge on Netflix or TikTok. We've got it
Exactly.
covered. Yeah, and that's
Exactly.
been playing out in different socio-cultural contexts for millennia. Like that pattern has to, like, we got to, like, I like the framing of biodegrading. Some people, like you might get a Schmachtenberger or someone like that, say we got to kill the current system. I don't really like that framing for lots of different reasons. And we're talking about really feeling connected to the way that someone like a Nora Bateson describes this stuff. But that is one that has to, we can't have a paternalism, I don't think, if the type of world that you and I are attempting to express some loving relation to the future possibility of. I just don't think we can have a paternalistic tendencies if that's going to come into being.
No, of course not. I mean, it fundamentally like negates any sense of, how do I put this? Love. Like it was Bell Hooks that wrote, there can be no love in a dynamic of domination.
Yeah.
And anything that is paternalistic or even maternalistic, right? You can suggest that between adults there is a pattern of domination there. And there is an unwillingness to allow people to flourish and for communities and cultures to flourish in an emergent space, essentially, that things have to be controlled so that they can be measured, so that the output or the eventual impact can be predicted, which is so ironic when you just consider the impact of like exponential economic growth and material consumption on the planet. Like the fact that it has spun out of this, tradition to like atomize and break down into the smallest pieces. And
totally,
it's almost as if there's this kind of like in physics, like in everything, every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. It's almost like some giant cosmic joke that desire to like cut everything up into its tiniest, teeniest, littlest thing has resulted in this kind of like exponentially catastrophic disaster that we cannot get a grip on and cannot measure, right? Like, our ocean temperatures are literally off the charts at this month and have been for the preceding months. So there's something in that. But yes, we have run out of time. Nate, thank you very much for coming. My final question for you, obviously, is who would you like to platform?
Okay, can I be cheeky? Because I would really like to platform 3 people. I would love to platform 100. So Professor Anne Polina, who's the chair of Indigenous Knowledges at the Nullanu Research Institute, which is University of Notre Dame, Australia. There's some incredible work she's doing on how Indigenous wisdom can sustain humanity, but particularly looking at governance stuff, which I've just found incredibly useful. Joanna Nalau, who's a professor at Griffith University and a really brilliant adaptation scientist, who's doing some fascinating stuff that, yeah, I think the two of you would have a wonderful conversation. And then another philosopher, Tim Adelin, who's the founder of Voicecraft. And Tim is just really, Tim is sort of like bringing back the spirit of Dialogos and the spaces and contexts that he seems to be able to sort of like seed or create the initial conditions for is like the conversations I've had in his presence when he's sort of stewarding and guiding have been amongst the best of and most enriching and of my life. And a number of times I've been silent the whole time. You know what? So there's just some, yeah, there's, I'd love to platform 100 people if I could, but those three are all doing amazing work.
Great. Nate, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you.